Welcome to Virtual VSC. My name is Kristen. I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator. No, wait, that's my old title. I'm the Visual Arts Program Manager here at the Vermont Studio Center. Thank you for coming here, zooming in from whatever time zone you were zooming in from. This month, we are recognizing, well, actually every month, but this month, we're recognizing the contributions and influence of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans for their history and culture. So I just want to say that's not the reason why Devon is here tonight. I've invited him a few times, especially in person, and that will happen someday. But I was excited for it to line up with this month being Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Devon Tsuno is an artist and fourth generation Angelino. His recent spray paint and acrylic paintings, artist books, community projects, and print installations focus on Japanese American history. Tsuno's recent solo exhibition, Shikata ga Nai, is a Yonsei story, so close, a Los Angeles story, indissociable from the complexities of intergenerational and collective trauma, fences and cages, gentrification, displacement, water and labor politics, and how we choose to live. Tsuno's interests have been central to his work with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Topaz Museum, Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art, the Hammer Museum, the Candlewood Arts Festival, and Gallery Lara in Japan. He is a 2017 Santa Fe Institute Water Rights Artist in Residence. He's a 2016 SP Art Community Grantee and was awarded a 2014 California Community Foundation Fellowship for Visual Art. Devon is currently an assistant professor of art at California State University in Dominguez Hills and collaborates with other artists and culture workers in the multi-aid groups J-Town Action and Solidarity and the 3D PPE Artist Network. Devon is represented by Residency Art Gallery in Inglewood, California. I know one of the organizations he has worked with is the Love Grant Project. And Alexandra Grant, who runs that, was here as a visiting artist in, I believe it was March of 2019. She spoke extremely highly of Devon's work, and I checked him out, and finally he's here to talk to us tonight. Without further ado, Devon, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be able to Zoom from Los Angeles all the way to your living rooms all over. I am going to share my screen right now. Can everybody see it okay? Cool. Thanks so much for inviting me. I guess it was a while ago. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. We started talking about me coming out to Vermont. I really loved it out there. I had a show there in Burlington at the university and really enjoyed it. The lake's just so amazing, and I love nature, as you'll see in this lecture. But I'm glad we're finally here, and I can share my work, so it's great. So I have been working in Los Angeles my whole life. I was born here. In the mid-city area of Los Angeles, which is right in the middle of the city. It's kind of right in between Hollywood and Beverly Hills and Koreatown. So it's very central, right in the middle of the city here. And I actually live in a house that I grew up in. I'm sitting in the living room right now, which is my studio. And it's around 4 o'clock here, so you can see the light coming in from the window. But I paint in the house I grew up in. So Los Angeles is a really kind of important place for me. And when I moved back to my childhood home, maybe about 15 years ago, I really started to think even more deeply about like what it meant to live in Los Angeles and what it meant to be back in the area I grew up in and why the landscape looks the way that it does. So I had been working on these types of paintings for quite a while. And this is kind of what I started to do when I was in graduate school at Claremont Graduate University back in the early 2000s. And I was doing these really big acrylic and spray paint paintings on handmade Japanese washi paper. And these are, I think, the first two that I did. They're pretty big. They're about 82 inches wide and 64 inches tall. And they're painted on a traditional Japanese paper that's made in the oldest paper factory in Japan. And I kind of really like this idea of, as a Japanese American, working on a surface that was made in Japan by another artist and kind of continuing that tradition in Los Angeles with very kind of LA materials, like the spray paint that's normally used for graffiti, and acrylic paint that we use here in LA called Nova Color, which is kind of like our little LA painter's secret acrylic paint. So this is the work that I had been doing for quite a while. And they're different plants from all over Los Angeles. I used to go down to the LA River a lot, and down there, it's kind of like a drainage ditch that all the water in Los Angeles collects to. And those of you who are from LA have been down there, and you've seen kind of what it has looked like down there historically, which is just kind of plants from all over the city. And I thought that was really kind of a really great representation of Los Angeles, that there's people from all over the world, that it's a very diverse city, and that somehow kind of we coexist. And there's a lot of tension in that, but also kind of an amazing beauty with it too. So these are those paintings that I was making at that moment. So kind of fast forward, I'm gonna kind of start more with what I'm doing presently. This was a couple of years ago. It was in the summer, and it was kind of during the height of a lot of the tensions created by the Trump administration. And the Trump administration was planning to incarcerate migrant children who were separated from their families at Fort Steele, which is a military base. And so there was a large protest at JANM in Little Tokyo, which is the Japanese American National Museum. And it was organized by Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Fort Steele when they were children. So I went down there, and I really wanted to show up because my family had been incarcerated during World War II, both sides of my family. And I was driving there and thinking, like, gosh, I really need a sign. Like, I couldn't think of what to write or what kind of sign to make. And I remembered that I had recently scanned this photograph of my aunt and uncle in the Rower, Arkansas camp, and this is their school picture. So I stopped at FedEx real quick, and I printed it out, and I made this sign, and I thought kind of why I was going, and I realized that I was going because I wanted people to listen to not really to me, but to my elders who had experienced this as children. So I wrote that, listen to the experts on there. And for me, it was a really pivotal turning point for me personally. Just kind of starting to get really more proactive and thinking about my family's responsibility, and being working in solidarity with other groups of people who were being impacted by immigration policy. So this is the actual photograph. You can see it kind of more close up. I scanned it really high res so you could see it. and kind of down the bottom right. There's no way you could pick them out, but my aunt and uncle are there. And this is at Rower in Arkansas. So just kind of the thought of children being incarcerated is pretty heavy. They were living in Los Angeles, and my grandparents, and in just a couple of weeks, they had to pack up all their stuff. They were only allowed to bring 2 bags with what they could carry, and they had to report to an assembly center, and then they were transferred on a bus. They were taken to Santa Anita Racetrack, which is a horse racing track in the Los Angeles area. It was my grandparents, and then I think she was 2, my aunt. So they lived in the horse stalls there for some months before they were transferred to Arkansas, where they lived in that camp. So that moment when I went to JANM and I made that poster, I started to really think about, wow, it's a 4th generation Japanese American. None of my cousins and none of my aunts and uncles or grandparents, nobody had ever gone back to see any of the camps. My dad's side was incarcerated at Topaz, which is in Utah. And then my mom's side was at Rower in Arkansas. So my son and wife were actually in Japan. My son was going to school there for the summer. So I was by myself. And I got in my truck after that protest, and I thought, wow, I think I'm going to drive there right now. So I went home. I threw a bunch of camping stuff in my truck, and I drove to Utah. And I arrived kind of in the late afternoon. I walked into the Topaz Museum, and this woman greeted me, and she asked me if I was part of there was I think a tour group or something had stopped by, and I said no. And she asked me why I was visiting Topaz. It's a tiny little town. And I said, oh, I came here specifically to come to the museum and to see the camp. And so she asked me if I had family there, and I said, yeah. So she showed me in the official government log, like my family's names. So I saw actually their handwriting even in this official document. And the woman there, her name is Jane. She was like, okay, well, look around. And they were closing, and she came back and asked me if I wanted to go see the site, if I was going to go to the site where they lived. And I said, yeah, I'm going to go do that. And she was kind of like a little bit worried because it's in the middle of nowhere and it's off site from the museum. So she kind of like sighed, and she was like, well, if you follow me to my house to drop off my vacuum cleaner, I'll after I drop it off, I'll drive you out. You can follow me, and I'll show you where your family lives. So I was like, whoa, okay. I definitely want to do that. So I followed her to her house. We dropped off the vacuum cleaner, and we went out there. And I think that's the thing that most people ask me first. They ask me what it looks like. They ask me what's left. I think a lot of people imagine there being like a big monument, tribute to them, and gigantic, beautiful museum that the government has put there. But it's not. It's really an overgrown field in the middle of a high desert where nobody wants to live, because that's where they took them. And everything is removed. Almost everything is removed. There's still some of the original fencing, and kind of at glance you think like, wow, they really got everything out of here because they wanted everyone to not remember what had happened there. It's a very military operation, and they even dug out the pipes out of the ground, so you can see in the ground they used to use ceramic pipes, water pipes, because they're cheaper. And so there are these big trenches in the ground where they dug the pipes up. And there's this like little pieces of remnants all littered all over the ground in between all of that brush. So we pulled up to this spot, like off of a dirt road, and Jane walked out of her truck and she pointed down on the ground and she's like, "Oh, this is it." And she kind of looked and she started picking up little things on the ground, and she found this area, which I'm looking down at in the photograph, which are these smooth rocks. And she told me that that's where the entrance of the barrack they lived in would have been at. So she speculated that those smooth rocks were kind of like a pathway they had created to walk up to where the stairs are at. And so it was pretty intense to look at it, because like my great grandparents and my grandparents, they put those rocks there. They lived there. And Jane reached down and she found this little metal hair roller. She picked it up and showed it to me, and she was like, "Oh, this was probably like your grandma's or something," which is kind of a pretty intense moment to be there, to drive from Fort Steele protests to come and be standing here just a couple of days later. So I took the photograph, and then she asked me if I was going to stay, and I said, yeah, I just kind of wanted to stay by myself for a little while and take it all in. And I started walking around, and I just started photographing and seeing things like this broken glass, and I was like, wow, that's like probably from the window, of where they lived. And I really didn't know what I was going to do with it. When I went there, I didn't know if I was going to make art about it or if I wanted to. But when I got back, the first thing I did was I went to go visit my auntie Chie, who's in this photograph that I took of her, because she's the last living person in my family who was incarcerated at Topaz. So she's here sitting in her living room in Gardena, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles where a lot of Japanese Americans settled after the war. And I took this photograph of her sitting in front of, it's called a Butsudan, which is like a Buddhist shrine that Japanese people oftentimes will have in their house, and it's to honor people who passed away. My auntie's is like particularly large for a Japanese American family. Normally, you see pretty small. Usually, they're like this big, kind of in the corner of the living room somewhere, in a Japanese American home. But hers is really big and fancy. And she's sitting in front of photographs of all of her family members who were incarcerated, who are all now passed away. So I took this photograph, and the photograph that it's superimposed on is a photograph of the dirt. If you walked over those smooth stones that are on the ground, it's the first piece of dirt where you would have entered into the home. So it's like right in the threshold of like the room, so where they lived, and you can see how dry the ground is, and all the old rusty nails from the structure they lived in, and little pieces of glass and things like that, and some of the native plants starting to kind of grow back after all these years. So I photographed my auntie, and then I went and photographed a few days later my grandmother on my mother's side, who was the last living person from my mom's side who was incarcerated, and so she's much older. She in this photograph she's 101, and she went there as a young adult with her kid, and then she had two kids in the camp who were photographed in that photograph, the school photograph. So those are her kids in that school photograph. And I just kind of happened to go to my mom's house, where she was taking care of my grandma, and she was all dressed up, and it was actually the last time she ever got dressed up and put makeup on, and looked kind of really pretty. And she was going to be honored that day by the Okinawa Club in Los Angeles for turning 101, being the oldest the oldest Okinawan American in Los Angeles. So I took this photograph of her. I was always really into photography. I was originally going to study photography in college, kind of switched to painting, but recently I've been practicing it quite a bit. And I went and took this photograph because of a conversation I had with another artist who I really admire in Los Angeles. Her name's Star Montana, and she had done this really amazing photograph of her grandmother. It's a really candid photograph of her grandmother, and really beautiful. And I was telling her how scared I was of photographing my grandmother, because I felt like there was this huge pressure of making her look beautiful. And what my family would think, what my cousins would think, what my aunt and uncle, did I do her justice? She's just such a huge force in our family, 101 years old, and has been through so much. But yeah, Star encouraged me to do it, and she's like, "You're gonna really regret it if you don't do it." So I was like, I gotta go. So I took this photograph, and I'm really glad, because she passed away just, I would say, I think it was maybe a couple months after I took this picture, as I was installing the exhibition. And it's superimposed, these photographs are superimposed over a home in Beverly Hills. And same thing, kind of at the threshold of the entrance of this home, there are these azalea bushes. And her husband, my grandfather, had planted them there in Beverly Hills. He was a gardener in Beverly Hills after the war. And I went and did the gardening route with my uncle after I came back from Topaz, because I wanted to see all the different places my grandfather worked. So I went to every single home, and I photographed every home. And this was the last bush of azaleas that my uncle said was still there, that he planted. So it's part of LA, the LA landscape, the Japanese American gardeners who landscape Beverly Hills, but aren't really acknowledged as part of that community, right? I thought it was really important to take this picture of those azaleas. And I turned them into these books, and I wanted them to be kind of untraditional books. I wanted them to be really large. They're big, they're really huge, and they don't have any text on the covers. It's just the photographs of Topaz and of Beverly Hills, and then the two important women in my life on the front covers. And inside of the books, there's over 200 pages of writing by incarcerated children and teenagers at the Topaz camp in Utah. So after I returned to LA from there, I reached out to Jane, who had given me the tour. And I had found out that, just kind of Googled her name. I didn't know who she was. I just thought she was somebody who worked at the museum who was really nice. And I found out that she was the founder of the museum, actually, and she had grown up in this small town. And her family ran the print shop that printed the newspapers that the schools inside of the camps put out. And so I had an opportunity to do a big project at MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, where I worked with teenagers from all over the city and mentored them for a few months on a project. And so I asked Jane, who is a retired English teacher, I believe, in that town, what she thought would be really important for young people in Los Angeles to know about Topaz. And she told me that we had these long conversations, and she thought about it, and then she told me that she had these newspapers that nobody had access to, that they were not digitized, and it was full of writing by all of the teenagers and the kids in the camp. And it's just like any school newspaper. When you read it, they talk about gossip and sports and dances and things like that. But when you read between the lines, it's very sad. Them talking about kind of how they're coping with the unknown of being separated from everything that they knew, losing everything that their family owned, trying to think about and come to terms with how they were going to prove to people that they were Americans and that they could be trusted, and also the fear of re-entering the community after they were going to leave the camps, what kind of trauma they had been put through, and the things they were thinking about, how they were going to be targeted, when they left the camp. So it's very hard to read, but I worked with my university where I'm a professor at. There's a great archivist there named Greg Williams, who started the Japanese American Digitization Project to kind of help digitize a lot of this material that's starting to disappear because that generation is getting really old. So we worked with Greg, and Greg's archivist digitized all the material, and then we reproduced it into this book. And the scans of all of the 200 and something pages of stories written by these teens and kids are now all available to anybody for free to access at the CSU Japanese American Digitization Project website. So you can go on there and read them if you like. So that trip was really huge for me, and it kind of led into me taking those photographs of my elders, which kind of led me to start thinking more about what they had been through when they were younger, and how I could work with them and archive some of the history with other people who are already doing the work. And so I did the show in Inglewood and at a residency gallery, and I turned that photograph of the ground, which is behind me here, into this kind of repeating wallpaper. And then I did a series of paintings of the plants at Topaz, the native plants grown over that specific location. So the title of this piece, Block 3710E, is actually the barrack number officially of where they lived. And these are the native plants overgrown in that space, kind of hiding that history underneath. You start digging through it and you see all of the little bits and pieces of what had happened there. And these paintings started to get more and more dense, and I started to combine them with paintings of the azaleas that my grandfather planted after the war in Beverly Hills. So I photographed those, and this is that home that I used in the book in color. And then I started to do these paintings of those azalea plants. So it's like a um, like during the war in the camp and then post-war, the relationship between Japanese Americans and the spaces they work in. So these paintings, I construct them in a similar way that I did my earlier work. I use spray paint and acrylic, but I started to paint these on canvas, and I build the surface up really slowly, and you can see that there's kind of like a texture, and it almost looks like stickers kind of stuck over each other, and you can kind of see the little shadows around the silhouettes of the plants because they're raised up. And I started to try to make the surface of the paint, try to make it actually look more like collaged paper, so that it has the thickness of washi paper. And then I started to resurface areas of the painting to absorb water and incorporate Japanese sumi ink into the washes with acrylic paint from Los Angeles. So this is that body of work. You can see how quite thick it is. All of those shadows around those shapes, those are just from the light hitting it, the thickness of it. So it has in person they have quite a thin but built up surface to them. So that was that exhibition that I did. So this was right now we measure time by the pandemic. This was right, the show opened 2 weeks before the shutdown in Los Angeles, before everything, the lockdown in Los Angeles. So the exhibition was up, there was an opening, people attended, and my grandmother passed away a few weeks before that, and she's laid to rest actually very close in Inglewood as well. And then the exhibition stayed up basically the entire pandemic because there was no reason to take it down. So it was up for a really long time at this commercial gallery, which I adore, in Inglewood. And it was quite memorable to do that show. So during the pandemic, after that show was up, I really kind of switched gears, and I was actually kind of purposefully taking a break from painting. I decided that I didn't want to paint too much at that point. And I was still kind of really engaged in the how I could work in solidarity with other people who were doing on the ground work, fighting against the culture of incarceration and incarceration of children in our country. So some of my peers, Rafa Esparza and Castle's, two really amazing artists in Los Angeles, they came up with this idea to hire airplanes that do skywriting and to skywrite messages in solidarity with people who are currently incarcerated, who were asylum seekers. So they raised some money and worked with a bunch of organizations that were already doing the on the ground work, like the ACLU and other organizations like that, and created a coalition of 80 artists, including myself and a cohort of Japanese Americans who had connections to incarceration in World War II. And they asked me to come up with something to write over the sky at the port of entry in Laredo, Texas, which was quite a responsibility, I felt. I took it really seriously, and it was maybe one of the hardest decisions ever to decide what to skywrite over the port of entry there. So I decided that I really couldn't make that decision on my own. So I started reaching out to a lot of my peers and other Japanese Americans who were involved in on the ground work. And I met this artist, Tracy, who had recently completed a residency in Little Tokyo, working with Cognate Collective and another artist, Umi, to make English translations of letters written by people who are currently detained at the border, and so, or by ICE. And so they had compiled these recordings of community members in Little Tokyo, not all Japanese Americans, because Little Tokyo and Los Angeles is not only Japanese Americans, that they read these letters. And so I created a phone number where you call this phone number and you can hear the audio recordings of community members in Little Tokyo reading these English translations of the letters. So this is what an excerpt of what you heard when you called the number.
I am 19. It was hard for me to turn 19 in May because of my birthday. I was detained at the Otay Mesa detention center. I fled El Salvador because of the violence and discrimination one faces there on a daily basis. Because of the lack of support for youth, I didn't come with any family members. I would like the world to know that as migrants, we are our family's hope, our country's hope for a better society.
So that was like an excerpt of the audio when you called the phone number. It was actually quite long. I think the recording was, I think it was over 5 minutes. And there were different stories like that, talking about asking for help and talking about why they were trying to escape violence to come to the U.S. to seek asylum and things like that. And the project was quite expansive because they hired every single airplane in the country that could skywrite. So it happened on 4th of July weekend in Los Angeles, and in the South, in Texas and New Mexico, and Florida, I think Florida, and then also New York, and in the East Coast. And a lot of people called the number, thousands of people called the phone number, and people from all over the country called because it was featured on NPR. And so a lot of people, I think, heard it there and called in. I didn't tell people this, but if you listen to the entire recording, which was quite long, it gave you the option of leaving a message at the end. And so lots of people left messages kind of in solidarity with the people whose letters were being read. So it was pretty intense. Also in that recording were letters written by community members in Little Tokyo back to people who had written the letters. So there was this dialogue happening. So you could check out actually more about that. It's called In Plain Sight, and the website is still up, and you can hear, I think the audio might be there as well. You might be able to hear. So this is the big fishing picture I promised everybody on Facebook. When I was promoting this talk, I said that I promised that I would show a fishing picture, which I love to do because whenever I get to talk about my art, I always want to talk about the things that I'm interested in, but also the things that bring me a lot of joy, and fishing is definitely one of them. And this is a really special fish because I caught it the day after I went to Topaz. So I decided that if I was going to make this pilgrimage back to the concentration camp my family lived in, that there needed to be a lot of fishing involved in order to cope with the tears, of going to this place. So on the way up, I stopped in Nevada and I fished for 2 days. It was epic, fishing by myself, caught a lot of huge rainbow trout. And then after Topaz, I decided to treat myself and hire a guide in Utah who was known for catching really big brown trout. And he took me out in the middle of the night and we fished with these gigantic rat flies for a predatory trophy size brown trout. And I know Vermont people, this is small in Vermont. You guys have really huge brown trout in the lake. This is like a normal size fish in Vermont. But in the West, this is as big as they get. It's very huge, 27 inches. So I'm very proud of it. So it's superimposed over, this is actually our only trout river in Los Angeles where you can fly fish for native trout, and it's in the San Gabriel Mountains. And they have these beautiful rainbow trout that used to migrate all the way to the ocean down the LA River and turned into steelhead when they used to do that back in the day. But LA is very close, and kind of the relationship of the city with nature is always a huge political debate in Los Angeles, but it's also not just a debate. It really does affect people's lives here. And Los Angeles, if you haven't been here before, it's a great city. I mean, it's wonderful. I love it. But there's not very much green space, and the green space is really fought over in Los Angeles. And this is actually the picture above is kind of what we consider green space almost. This is the Arroyo Seco. It's a stream that's a tributary of the LA River and is actually a tailwater of that rainbow trout stream that I just pictured. So has been converted as well as the LA River into these concrete drainage ditches that are flood control. And, they're not pretty. But they protect the city from being flooded. But all of our water falls into it and goes right into the ocean and doesn't irrigate very much. So that's been a sore subject for many decades in Los Angeles amongst Angelenos. It's also been a space that a lot of artists have gone down to make work. And myself, I go down there and go fishing all the time for these really huge carp. But it's also been a home for people for many, many decades. People have been displaced and unhoused people live down there. So above is a picture of what it looks like now, and below is what they want to turn it into. And I certainly would love to live next to that down there at the bottom. And I think most of us in Los Angeles would, but most of us know that we wouldn't be able to afford it once they make it that nice. You have to probably be able to buy a house for about $1.5 million or more to live in a place like that here. And the community that surrounds these irrigation channels, they're mostly communities where they're renters. Not many people own homes around these spaces. And so as the city starts to redevelop these areas, the rent's going to go up and it's going to displace a lot of people, and it already is. So I think about that a lot. I mean, I really like the LA River, and I like going down there and fishing. And before it was illegal to actually fish down there, which I actually enjoyed even more. Because there are less people. This is the LA River, maybe like when I was working at Sport Chalet. I worked there for 13 years selling fishing tackle and camping stuff. This was probably 15 years ago. Now it looks even more cleaned up. There's even less graffiti, but you can see that they painted over all of it. And for me, it's like a family thing. To go down there, spend time with my son. I teach him how to fly fish down there. We fish for these carp that are considered invasive species. They're not native, and it's really the only thing that can live there because it's a drainage ditch. And so I have always been working with that space and thinking about water in Los Angeles and its connection to the displacement and its connection to the people who live in LA. And so I've been making this type of work prior to my trip to Topaz, also in collaboration with other organizations like the Theodore Payne Foundation that promote native plants and water conservation through gardening in LA. And my work over the years, I've been really lucky to meet people like that at the Theodore Payne who I learned from. I always think about, like, as an artist, that what a wonderful opportunity to meet people and learn more about the things I'm interested in and make work from the perspective of somebody who's trying to learn more, and not as the in a didactic way as an expert who's trying to educate everybody on things that they don't know. And so I've learned so much through this process, and I've gone to do things like this. This is a big building wrap I did at a college. Reproduced my work into, this is a digital vinyl wrap of a small painting that I reproduced. I do a lot of community projects too that are interactive, that some people would call like social practice type projects. This is out in the desert in Borrego Springs, where I worked with migrant farm workers and who work at the grapefruit farm there. And they originally were migrant farm workers, but there's this one family, the Forte family, that worked really hard. And this is Pedro Forte, and he finally secured a full-time job after being in Borrego Springs for 40 years. It took him 40 years to get a full-time job at a grapefruit farm, 40 years. And so he finally was able, he was one of 3 full-time employees. It was him and his 2 sons he was able to hire to help with the grapefruit farm. And so my grandfather, the one who planted the flowers in Beverly Hills, was a migrant farm worker when he came to the US and around like 1918, 1919, somewhere around there. He came when he was 16, came by himself. He met his father. His father died while they were working. Didn't know what happened to his dad. His dad was on another farm picking fruit. And he lived since 16, made a life for himself and all of that. So I was very interested in kind of what has changed in the business and what hasn't changed. So I went and I made friends with this family. They were very kind, and they showed me the farm and taught me a lot about the farm there. And Pedro said to find work in the United States, Pedro Forte walked through the desert alongside his brother, leaving behind a 1-year-old and his pregnant wife. He's worked in Borrego Springs for 40 years since leaving Guanajuato, Mexico. He now has 11 children and is a farmer at Sealy Ranches, where he harvests grapefruit. So I made these reusable produce bags where the public they have water problems in Borrego Springs too. So I made this big water table with the grapefruit, and the public could come and eat the grapefruit together and take some home and reuse this produce bag when they go to the grocery market, to kind of think about the people who help them enjoy something like grapefruit. So my work manifests in different ways. Sometimes it's painting, sometimes in artist books, sometimes more activist type things, community projects. This is St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a big installation that I did of wallpaper and from the LA watershed, and kind of a contrast between the handmade and the digital, which I'm super into. This is that painting that I turned into that gigantic building wrap. These are native plants in Los Angeles, kind of overgrown and confronted with non-native plants. Sometimes I'll have like these big budgets where I think about making something really fancy out of custom-made wallpaper, and other times I'm like on a shoestring budget like any artist. So these are actually photocopies. So sometimes I'll turn the wallpaper, I'll design it out of photocopies too. So I like kind of like these kind of old technologies too, like the risograph machine, which is an old screen printing machine that people used to use in churches to make flyers and stuff like that. And I'll make zines. Um, I like people to be able to take things away or do temporary installations of patterns of native plants or patterns of water out in the middle of the desert. Um, I like to see it in different forms. Functional things like on a bicycle, like this is a Cannondale bicycle I got to design, which um, working at Sports Chalet, it's a pretty big deal to have your own bike. And every kid wants to have a skateboard, so that was pretty cool to do skateboards. So I'm all over the board. I think the work can exist in many different spaces. It can be community spaces. I can make beach towels out of it to raise money for kids to have after school art classes. I can do projects with middle schools to promote art and literacy. I can teach these things to my students at Cal State Dominguez Hills and how they can work in their own communities and talk about the history of their own spaces. And during the pandemic, I really was concerned about my wife, who's a nurse, and people around her. And I switched and stopped making paintings, and I started making face shields. I created a coalition of like a whole bunch of artists all over the country, and we raised money and bought 3D printers, and we printed over 20,000 face shields for frontline workers. We trained Navajo Nation people to print their own, and we sent them 3D printers. And that's what I spent a lot of my time during the pandemic doing. And just recently, I switched from that, since there's less of a need for the face shields, to collaborating with my peers in Little Tokyo. And we started this group called J-Town Action and Solidarity. And we partnered with this really amazing educator and activist, Theo Henderson, who runs this podcast and activist project called We the Unhoused. And we've been working with him to support unhoused residents in Little Tokyo for the past 15 weeks, bringing them things that they need, like energy and daily supplies, PPE, food, clothes, things like that. Things that they request has been really guided by the voice of the unhoused community there, and not by politicians and people who think they know what unhoused people need. So we ask unhoused people what they need, and we work with them and learn. We make mistakes because we're learning together, but it's part of I think one of the big shifts in my practice and just as a human being in the last I would say 5 years, just like what that means to be in solidarity with other people and to listen to other people and not only work from your own perspective, but what real solidarity means, and also what mutual aid means, and kind of rethinking the charity model of handing things out to people, kind of rethinking that as how can we work together, right? How can that be part of our growth as a community to heal from a lot of the things that we're troubled by right now and have been for many, many years. So I'm still learning, and my art is kind of where that comes from. And my guiding force has always been my grandmother, and this is her at the Women's March with my mom and my aunt, and they had this sign that says, "Locked up by U.S. Press 1942 to 1946, never again." And it's a really powerful moment in my family history for them to be out there and I've been thinking a lot about what that means, not just for myself, but for other people. And a lot of Japanese Americans say that they really felt that they didn't have allies when they were incarcerated. And so I think it's really important for us to show up for other communities that are being impacted by similar effects of white supremacy. So it's been a journey for me, but I'm just getting started. So that's what I've been doing. Thank you for listening.
That was great. Thank you, Devon. I know you actually have to get out soon.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Devon has a student. Is it their final show or?
Yeah, it's their final show. They're graduating. My seniors. It's the first class at Cal State Dominguez Hills that I taught most of them only online. It's quite different, but we're gonna celebrate, and they're having their opening. So
Yeah.
I gotta run. But
Yeah, we don't have time for questions. So what we're going to have to do is just email you incessantly with all of our questions.
Yeah, and you can also find me on Instagram. My Instagram is Devon Tsuno Studio, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. Let's keep in touch. Thanks everybody for coming.
Have fun with your students.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.